In Chapter 9, we talk about nonprofit organization staff and volunteers. And this is where we talk about not only the difference between paid staff and volunteers, but how important the volunteer component is to the success of nonprofit organizations in general. Your textbook contains an overview of management theories, and you'll want to read the management theories and understand what they are and how they apply to nonprofit organizations, because the theories of management will be applicable to nonprofit organizations just as they are to for-profit businesses and government organizations. And you'll want to know Frederick Taylor and his scientific management theory, the time and motion studies, and how he approached management as and looking at the employees as cogs in a wheel, and how we have moved on from that basis. But to understand those basic foundations of management theories, Frederick Taylor's an important figure. And then also know about the Hawthorne experiments and what those were, and how they influence the social and psychological factors. Just being supervised had an impact on the productivity of workers. And so the evolution of management theory continues to this day, but to understand the changes over time on the approach to management is important for you to have at least an overview and an understanding of. So talking about human motivations is important for you as well, to get an introduction to what motivates not only the paid staff but the volunteers in nonprofit organizations. So this is where you'll find that managers' explicit and implicit beliefs about human nature help shape their management style. So it's important to understand that an individual's beliefs about human nature shape their management styles and will shape your management style as well. Know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs that was developed in 1954. You've probably run across this many times in your academic career, where humans' needs progress from lower levels to higher levels as the lower level need met. So that is the pyramid that you've most likely seen, where the safety and security needs are at the bottom, and then the human needs as they are met progress from the lower levels up to self-actualization. So understand that. And be familiar with McGregor's theory X and Y, and this is the authoritarian management versus the participative management, and to understand what that theory is and how that applies. And then McClelland in 1961 said that managers have their own psychological needs that influence how they behave in regard to their subordinates, and that refers to the need for achievement, the need for power over others, the need for affiliation or good relationships with others. So these human motivation theories will be important for you just to know what they are and how they are applicable to the leadership in nonprofit organizations, and just understand the basics of those. So the discussion of human motivations continues, and the first item on this slide is the Myers-Briggs type indicators, and you may have run across one of these already. This is a paper and pencil personality test that's based on the theories of psychologist Carl Jung, and when you take the test you end up being categorized into certain personality types, and this provides individuals with insights about their own perspectives and their own preferences, and it may help them understand their own behavior and that behavior of others with whom they work. And then also Herzberg developed motivators and satisfiers and hygiene factors, which are dissatisfiers. And we're going to talk about those in the next slide, about how those satisfiers and dissatisfiers may motivate or unmotivate people in the workplace. Here's a graphic illustration of Herzberg's motivators, which are the satisfiers, and the hygiene factors, which are the dissatisfiers. So if you look in the left-hand column, you'll see the motivators or the satisfiers, and these are related to the job and to motivation. And they would include things such as achievement, recognition, the work itself, advancement, growth, and responsibility. So those would be what would motivate people in the workplace, according to this theory. And then in the right-hand column are the hygiene factors, or what are dissatisfiers, and they're related to the environment itself. And they would tend to unmotivate or dissatisfy an individual in the workplace. And those could be company policies and administration, relationships with the supervisor, interpersonal relations with coworkers, working conditions, compensation, and status and security. So it's important for you to understand that those are the factors involved in Herzberg's motivators, which are satisfiers and dissatisfiers. You'll want to read in the textbook about the Princeton study and the motivation as it relates to nonprofit organizations. And this is important for anybody who is involved in the leadership of a nonprofit organization to understand. The Princeton study actually surveyed nonprofit workers, and they found that nonprofit workers are motivated by the work itself, the work that they're doing in the nonprofit organization. That can be inherently rewarding. Nonprofit employees are driven more by the mission than the pay, and this would be logical to anyone who would be thinking about working for a nonprofit organization, because typically the salaries wouldn't be the highest motivator because they normally don't pay an extraordinary amount. So more than 70% of the employees surveyed said they were actually satisfied with their pay, that there's other sources of satisfaction were more important. They were satisfied with flexibility, collaborative decision making, and being treated as well-rounded human beings. So know about the Princeton study and what it said about motivation to work for a nonprofit organization. What motivates individuals to be interested in working for a nonprofit organization in the first place, and oftentimes it's the satisfaction of the work itself, being interested in the mission of the organization versus the expectation of high salaries. Other theories related to nonprofit motivation would be expectancy theory, where decisions are based on expected outcomes. Operant conditioning, now that's B.F. Skinner, and you may have heard this one before, where we tend to repeat behaviors that are rewarded and tend to not repeat those that are not rewarded. Social learning, where you observe others, and goal-setting theories, those are all also related to nonprofit motivation. So be familiar with those. Well, how should the nonprofit leaders act? In a study by Denhart in 2009, they were able to determine the items that are on this slide are the recommended ways of nonprofit leaders to act to be most effective. So let's review those. Nonprofit leaders should be reflective and proactive about their own motivation. So that's understanding how your own motivation is affecting your behavior, and then be aware what motivates you is not necessarily what will motivate others. Have a realistic expectation about the extent to which you can influence the motivation of others. Participate in setting clear and challenging goals. That would be for yourself as well as for others. To think about the salience of various rewards. To be honest with people about what rewards are possible within the organization and what rewards are not. To treat people equitably and fairly. To make the work satisfying and meaningful. To think about life stages of the people that you work with and offer appropriate support. So these are ways of acting for nonprofit leaders that are recommended to be successful. And just to review that last one more time, if you don't already understand the stages of life that people go through and how their motivations vary depending on if they're young and just getting started as in a career, or if they're in the later stages of life and are being reflective and wanting to contribute and give back, that will change the level of motivation that an individual will have in being affiliated with a nonprofit organization. So these are the recommended ways of acting for nonprofit leaders to be successful. We're going to talk about nonprofit volunteers and how volunteers are a major component of the workforce of many nonprofit organizations. And you'll want to understand that volunteers are critical to the nature of most nonprofit organizations. And there are 3 types of volunteers that are discussed in your book, and you'll want to read about the study by Shannon Kleiner. They talk about spot volunteers, regular volunteers, and those that are pressured to volunteer. So their motivations will be different. The types of volunteers are different. a spot volunteer is somebody who may show up for an individual activity or program and not be a regular volunteer, would be different than those who would volunteer for a nonprofit organization on a regular basis, who may come in and have a regular work schedule, who may appear to be more like paid staff but actually be non-paid. So the regular volunteer is very different from the spot volunteer. And then the third type is an individual who may be pressured to volunteer, who may be volunteered by somebody else, who may feel that they have to, who may be doing community service or something. So that those who are pressured to volunteer would be a third category, completely different from somebody who would show up once in a while, or someone who is a volunteer on a regular daily basis. Then the key questions about volunteer motivation that we will need to answer, that you'll want to answer in reviewing the material in the textbook, is what motivates people to become volunteers in the first place. We talked about the altruistic motivation, the giving back, and wanting to contribute, what the mission of the organization is. So know what motivates people to become volunteers in the first place, and what factors motivate volunteers to perform at a high level and continuing in their volunteer role. So nonprofit organization leadership will affect those, how people feel about their volunteering role, and how much they want to continue in their volunteer role. So read about all that in the textbook and understand this volunteer section, because it's really an important one. In this slide, we talk about volunteer characteristics in general. Your text includes a lot of information about studies of volunteers, and you'll want to understand the makeup of volunteer characteristics. So here's a few that I've put in this slide for you to review, but you'll want to understand the volunteer segment. In 2009, more than 27% of the U.S. population volunteered more than 8 billion hours of service. So that underscores the size and importance of the volunteer segment. Volunteers are most likely to be between ages of 35 and 64, more likely to be women than men. Their common motivations are developing positive relationships with other volunteers, serving the organization's mission, and also giving back to society, which we've talked about. Importance of volunteers assigned to define responsibility. So these are things that are important to volunteers. Having assigned and defined responsibilities, having a reasonable work schedule, and having competent supervision. So understand characteristics of volunteers. This slide outlines best practices associated with volunteers. So these were the items that were determined are the best way to work with volunteers in a nonprofit organization. Assess the need for volunteers and develop volunteer job descriptions. So volunteers feel that they need a volunteer job description to outline what their expectations are, what they should be doing. The organization should have formal volunteer policies. You should provide a sufficient budget and personnel to manage the volunteer program. And in large nonprofit organizations, there may be an individual or there may be a staff of individuals that are assigned to working with volunteers. It's that important. Recruiting and hiring volunteers as if they were employees. So what I mentioned is having the same kind of process that you would go through with your volunteers as you would with your paid staff. Provide an orientation and training to volunteers. This comes up a lot when talking with volunteers. They feel like they need to be oriented better and they need to be trained better. So having an orientation and training program for volunteers is essential. And setting clear goals, evaluating performance, and recognizing achievement. Recognizing volunteer achievement is critical. That's why you'll see within nonprofit organizations where there may be an annual event or there may be a more periodic recognition of the volunteers and the importance of their contributions. So that's acknowledging the volunteers, evaluating the performance of volunteers, giving them feedback, setting clear goals, and communicating all this to the volunteers. So this is a summary of how best practices are implemented in volunteer or with volunteers in nonprofit organizations. So you'll want to understand those.